Hello, and welcome to the first podcast in a new series on Jewish temple theology, or perhaps a more specific title would be Who Was Jesus to His Followers? There has been much new scholarship in the past decades, both Jewish and Christian, on this topic. In this series, we will not be searching for the Jesus of history or Christianity, but rather the Jesus that his followers and contemporaries knew. This particular podcast will be a brief introduction to the topic. My name is Jeffrey Taylor, and I will be your podcast host. To answer the question of who was Jesus to his followers, and what was he trying to accomplish with his teachings and his activities, we must abandon much of what the Christian church has taught us in the past. Jesus and his followers were devout Jews attempting to bring about the kingdom of God through the creation of a restored and purified temple and priesthood, with Jesus as the Messiah and high priest. At no point were they trying to establish a new religion outside of Judaism. This podcast series will address the following general points. Number 1, Jewish temple theology and the role of the high priest and temple priesthood play a central, dominating role in the Second Temple Judaism of Jesus' time. Number 2, the Jewish Second Temple priesthood of Jesus' time were taken to be corrupt, presiding over a polluted and unclean temple that was a front for Roman oppression. This is supported from writings of numerous Second Temple era Jewish sects, such as the Essenes, the Qumran community, the disciples of John the Baptist, the Nazarites, the Enochites, the Ebionites, the sect that wrote the Psalms of Solomon, and we'll throw in some Pharisees. Number 4, there is also support in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Jewish Apocrypha, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of Josephus, and particularly the Psalms of Solomon. Number 5, the writers of the Gospels, Revelation, the letters of John and Hebrews, saw Jesus and his disciples as the Messiah, a new high priest among the new priesthood of his disciples. Jesus' mission was both political and religious, to establish the kingdom of God that would include the elimination of the current temple and priesthood and replace it with a new purified temple and priesthood that would include all of the nations. And finally, number 7, this new temple and priesthood could only be achieved through a time of suffering, tribulation, and even martyrdom. So here is a brief summary of this particular podcast. Number 1, the historical content. Early Christianity emerged from Jewish temple theology, with Jesus and his followers practicing within Jewish religious traditions for over 40 years in Jerusalem. Christianity did not formally separate from Judaism until around between 130 and 150 of the Common Era. This makes the New Testament essentially Jewish in nature. The significance of the temple. The original gospel message centered on the restoration of Solomon's temple, not the corrupt Second Temple of Jesus' time. The book of Revelation and early Christian writings reflect imagery and concepts from Solomon's temple, not the Second Temple of Jesus' time. Jesus as the high priest. Jesus was presented as Melchizedek, representing an older and superior priesthood to the priesthood of Aaron's lineage. The connection to Melchizedek is now considered key to understanding the New Testament And lastly, Christian origins. Core Christian practices like the Eucharist originated from temple rituals originally exclusive to the priesthood. Christian doctrine developed rapidly because it expressed pre-existing temple beliefs in light of Jesus' life, and works. Jesus did not exist in a vacuum. He lived in a particular time and place with a specific religious worldview that was a result of over 1,000 years of cultural history. He had a family, disciples, and followers that continued to worship and practice his Jewish ideas in Jerusalem for over 40 years after his death. The great puzzle is how early Christian reflection on Jesus emerged so clearly, so rapidly, and with such a high degree of definition. What patterns of interpretation already in Jewish religion crystallized around the person of Jesus and his work? It is commonly held that the earliest interpretations of Jesus were low, in other words, something like the final prophet, and that later on, interpretations evolved into high, being the divine Son. This evolution may not be the case. Also, these high estimates of his identity and mission originate not in the minds of others, but in Jesus' own mystical experience and insights. As the first and best interpreter of himself, he is the author and finisher of the faith, rather than the early Jewish Christian communities. The original gospel message was about the temple, not the corrupted temple of Jesus' own time, but the original tabernacle and temple of Solomon, which had been destroyed some 600 years earlier. In Jesus' time, all that remained were memories and the hope that one day the true temple and all it represented would be restored. The majority, if not all, of the books of the New Testament were penned by Jews. Since Christianity did not separate itself from Judaism until the years between possibly 130 CE and 150 CE, the collection of books and letters we call the New Testament is essentially Jewish in nature. Let's be clear by what we mean when one uses the word temple in Judaism. There are actually 4 that span over 1,000 years. The first is the tabernacle, the portable temple used in the wilderness. Next came the first temple, built by Solomon on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Then there was an interim temple in Jerusalem, built after the Babylonian captivity, which was called the Second Temple. That Second Temple was rebuilt by Herod, and he did a restoration that rebuilt it at about the time of Jesus, and this is the temple that was destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. Jesus, in the earliest of Christianity, was presented as the high priest from the first temple, Solomon's temple. He was Melchizedek returned to his people. The restoration of the first temple was the hope of the first Christians, and to set them, their writings, and their presentation of Jesus anywhere else than in the temple setting distorts what they were preaching and misrepresents the original gospel. This presentation of Jesus as high priest comes to us from the letters to the Hebrews. The book of Revelation is one of several books that are key to understanding early Christianity. Because it is steeped in temple imagery, most people find it an opaque and impossible text, but people who thought in this temple manner also wrote and read the rest of the New Testament. The earliest Christian writings assume a worldview and a setting which can only have come from the temple, and not the actual temple of their own time, the Second Temple. Since the book of Revelation describes the heavenly throne and the heavenly court of angels and elders, this must have been a memory of the Holy of Holies in Solomon's Jerusalem temple, which was furnished with a great golden throne called the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. It used to be thought that many fundamentals of the Christian faith came from Greek culture, since their roots could not be found in the Hebrew Scriptures. It was assumed that any concept of the Trinity or the Son of God could not possibly have come from the strict monotheism of Hebrew tradition. The Holy Wisdom, to whom the great churches were dedicated, has been explained as a personification of a late development in Greek philosophy influenced by the Egyptian goddess Isis. None of this is necessary once the temple roots of Christianity are recognized. Melchizedek's priesthood was more ancient than Aaron's, and the letter to the Hebrews argues that the Melchizedek priesthood is superior to the priesthood of Aaron's or the Levitical priesthood. This is in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 11 through 19. Now Aaron was the brother of Moses, but Melchizedek was priest in Jerusalem in the time of Abraham. Melchizedek represented the older true faith. Since the discovery of the Melchizedek text among the Dead Sea Scrolls, called 11Q13, we can see the significance of this claim that Jesus was Melchizedek. One damaged line of the text seems to describe teachers who have been kept hidden and secret, and the whole text clearly celebrates the return of the divine Melchizedek to rescue his own people from the power of the evil one. Melchizedek was expected to appear exactly when Jesus began his public ministry, and a description of the role of Melchizedek is exactly how Jesus is presented in the Gospels. Jesus as Melchizedek was formerly thought to be peripheral to the understanding of his ministry, something claimed by the early Christians because it was known that Jesus had no family claim to the priesthood of Aaron. Jesus as Melchizedek can now be seen as the key to the New Testament, and the implication of this is that Melchizedek's temple was the world of the first Christians. Many other writings from the era of the Second Temple regard it as the impure center of an apostate priesthood. This does not mean that they preferred the non-sacrificial worship of the synagogue. It shows that they were cherishing the memory of an older faith, that of the anointed kings in Jerusalem and their lost Temple of Solomon. Many of the voices in those writings complained that they were still in exile, and that for them there had been no glorious return in the time of Joshua, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. The earliest of those voices is heard towards the end of Isaiah, when the prophet complains of watchmen who are blind and without knowledge. This is in Isaiah chapter 56, verse 10. This is temple talk. The watchmen were the priests, the angel guardians of the temple, and they had rejected wisdom who gave them knowledge. Opening eyes was a sign of the restoration of the true priesthood, and so the prophecy of Joel chapter 2, verse 28. I quote, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions." Isaiah condemned the restored Second Temple as a harlot on a hilltop. This is in Isaiah 57, verse 7. Who excluded the ancient worshippers of the Lord and made a mockery of the priestly rituals. Jesus was described and remembered as a great high priest. This is found in Hebrews 4, verses 14 through 15. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are. In Hebrew, Jesus is Melchizedek, raised up by the power of an indestructible life. This is in Hebrews 7, verse 16. Who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. This distinguishes Jesus from the priesthood of Aaron that is of the tribe of Levi and does descend genetically. And it is Jesus who had offered the final atonement sacrifice to fulfill and supersede the temple rites. I'll now read from Hebrews chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. Now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. Beyond the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Much Christian study of the Old Testament has concentrated on the history of Israel, especially the traditions of the Deuteronomists found in Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. The Deuteronomists, so called because they promoted the viewpoint of the book of Deuteronomy, were devotees of the Moses strand of Israel's religion and hostile to both temple and monarchy. The Hebrew scriptures, as we know them, were preserved, edited, and transmitted by the priests and scribes of the Second Temple, the very people whom the long exile tradition condemned as impure, apostates who had altered the scriptures. The Old Testament does tell the story of Israel's religion, but not in the way that is often assumed. The key event was the great purge in the time of King Josiah at the end of the 7th century BC, when everything that the Deuteronomists deemed impure was removed from the temple and destroyed. In other words, the Moses religion, with the Ten Commandments and the Aaron priesthood, did not finally replace the Abrahamic faith and the Melchizedek priesthood until just before the first temple was destroyed. Okay, there's a lot on this slide to read, and I don't believe I'm going to read it all, but feel free to pause the video and you can read at your leisure. The most important result of Josiah's purge was the introduction of true monotheism. The earlier religion had known of God Most High, the deity worshipped by Melchizedek. This is in Genesis 14:19. El Shaddai, the deity of the patriarchs. This is in Exodus 6:3, and Yahweh, who appeared in human form, for example, to warn Noah safely into the ark in Genesis 7:16. There is no proof that these were one and the same deity. Only later were all these ancient forms said to be identical. It was the prophet of the exile who declared that Yahweh was El, and that there was no other God. This is in Isaiah 43. In the more ancient names for these deities, however, we glimpse the Father. This is the God Most High. The Son, Yahweh, the one who appeared in human form, and the Mother, El Shaddai, whose name literally means God with breasts. Once again, you can pause and take the time to read this at your own leisure. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was compiled from a variety of older sources after the destruction of the original temple, after the demise of the monarchy, and after Josiah's purge. The stories are presented as a historical sequence, but they also reflect a more recent development, that the religion of the patriarchs was finally superseded by the religion of Moses as late as the 6th century CE. It was then that the name of the God of the patriarchs was replaced by the name of the God of Moses. Jewish tradition was remembered and recorded as late as the 4th century CE in the Jerusalem Talmud. Many priests of the original temple had fled to Arabia after the time of Josiah's purge. They must have taken with them the faith of the older temple. According to Galatians, Paul also spent time in Arabia before returning and then arguing that the roots of Christianity lay in the faith of Abraham. Did Paul possibly meet with the descendants of these priests from Solomon's temple? There was no fixed canon of Hebrew scripture until after the advent of Christianity, and there is good reason to suspect that the familiar Hebrew canon was established in reaction to Christianity. Even the Hebrew text from which the English Bible is translated was fixed at the end of the 1st century CE and excluded the versions which the first Christians and the Dead Sea Scrolls community had used. In other words, the Christians were the heirs of those who had rejected the Second Temple and its tradition and longed for the restoration of the true Temple of Solomon. The temple tradition, once it has been identified, is clear in the Gospels themselves. The role of the royal high priest, in the older temple, this would have been the anointed king, was to carry away the sin and uncleanliness of the people so that they could be restored within the bonds of the covenant. The clearest picture of this is in Isaiah 53. It is no coincidence that this is one of the most frequently cited texts in the New Testament. The royal high priest was the great angel in human form, the man who passed between heaven and earth. The vision of Daniel 7 is frequently cited regarding the Son of Man, the human figure descending with clouds to his enthronement. The royal high priest was born as Son of God in the Holy of Holies. The two temple rituals, originally exclusive to the high priest, were carrying blood into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement and eating the most holy shewbread on the Sabbath. These were combined to become the Christian Eucharist. It is beyond doubt that the faith of the temple became Christianity. Images and practices that most Christians take for granted, such as priesthood, the shape of a traditional church building, or the imagery of sacrifice and atonement, are all obviously derived from the temple. By reconstructing the world of the older faith, it can be shown that invocation of the divine presence, incarnation, resurrection, the Mother of God, the self-offering of the Son of God, and theosis, which is the human becoming divine, were also drawn from temple theology. The gospel, as it was first preached by Jesus and as it was developed and lived by the early church, concerned the restoration of the true temple. This explains how Christian doctrine was able to develop so quickly. It was the expression of a long-established set of beliefs in the light of the life and work of Jesus.